A life forever changed. The night air was crisp as Dr. Samuel Carter pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of St. Augustine Medical Center, the fluorescent lights overhead casting long shadows across the pavement. His hands ached from the long hours in surgery, his mind still replaying the delicate operation he had just performed. The young girl he had saved from heart failure would recover, but Samuel knew that medicine was unpredictable. No matter how skilled a doctor was, sometimes fate had its own cruel plans. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes before stepping out of his car. The world outside the hospital seemed so distant, so different from the controlled chaos of the operating room. He had spent years perfecting his craft, earning a reputation as one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the state. His name was printed on medical journals, his award hung proudly in his office, yet none of it seemed to fill the void inside him. As he made his way to the hospital doors, something caught his attention. A woman, hunched over near the entrance, sobbing softly into her hands. She was dressed in worn jeans and an oversized coat, her frame trembling in the cold. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before walking toward her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you all right?" The woman's head jerked up, her eyes red and swollen. She looked startled at first, but then relief flickered across her face. She choked on her words, shaking her head. "Please, my son, he's dying." Samuel's chest tightened. "Tell me what's wrong," he urged. The woman fumbled in her bag, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "His name is Jeremiah. He has a heart defect. A hole. They said he needs immediate surgery or he won't make it. But we have no insurance, no savings. I've been turned away from 3 hospitals. They won't even let us through the doors." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Samuel felt something deep inside him stir. He had seen desperation before, seen families brought to their knees by impossible choices. "Where is he?" Samuel asked, his voice softer now. She pointed toward the far side of the parking lot, where an old sedan sat with its hazard lights flashing dimly. The back door was slightly open. Without hesitation, Samuel hurried toward the car. Inside, a small boy lay curled in the back seat, wrapped in a thin blanket, his breathing shallow and labored. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. The boy's tiny hands clutched a well-loved action figure, the paint worn away from years of use. "Jeremiah." Samuel knelt beside him, carefully placing his fingers on the boy's wrist to check his pulse. The boy's eyelids fluttered weakly. "Mama," he rasped. "I'm right here, baby," the woman said, kneeling beside Samuel. Samuel felt the faint, irregular rhythm of Jeremiah's heart beneath his fingertips. His pulse was weak, far too weak. This child didn't have weeks. He had days, maybe hours. "He needs immediate surgery," Samuel said, standing up quickly. He turned to the woman. "What's your name?" "Danielle," she whispered, her fingers gripping the car door like a lifeline. Samuel placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Danielle, listen to me. I want you to take a deep breath." She did, shakily. "I'm admitting your son right now. I don't care about insurance. I don't care about money. He's coming inside, and I'm going to do everything in my power to save him." Danielle's lips parted in shock, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You mean it?" she gasped. Samuel nodded. "I became a doctor to save lives, not just the ones who can afford it." A strangled sob escaped Danielle's throat, and she covered her mouth with her hand, as if holding back years of helplessness. Samuel turned back to Jeremiah, lifting the frail boy into his arms. The child barely weighed anything, his body so light it sent a fresh wave of determination surging through Samuel. As he carried Jeremiah through the hospital doors, he called over his shoulder, "We need a trauma team. Now." A race against time. Within seconds, the emergency department sprung to life. Nurses rushed forward with a stretcher, swiftly hooking Jeremiah up to oxygen and heart monitors. His heart rate was dangerously low, and his oxygen saturation levels were dropping by the second. "Prep the ore," Samuel barked as he flipped through the boy's worn medical records. The congenital heart defect was severe, worse than the initial assessment suggested. The head nurse, Linda, frowned as she reviewed the paperwork. "Dr. Carter, there's no insurance on file. You know the administration." "I don't care about the administration," Samuel snapped, his voice edged with urgency. "Tell them the boy is under my personal care. If they want to fire me, they can do it after I save his life." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line before she nodded. "I'll get the team ready." Danielle stood frozen by the doorway, clutching her arms as tears streamed down her face. "What can I do?" she whispered. Samuel turned to her, softening his tone. "Pray, and be here when he wakes up." She nodded, her whole body trembling as she watched the team wheel her son toward the operating room. Samuel took one last deep breath before following them in. A fight for life. The operating room was silent except for the beeping monitors and the rhythmic sound of Samuel's breathing behind his surgical mask. "Scalpel," he murmured. The nurse handed it to him, and with precise hands, he made the first incision. Time became meaningless. Every second was a battle. Suturing, repairing, delicately mending the fragile walls of Jeremiah's heart. Sweat dripped down Samuel's forehead as he worked, his mind solely focused on the task before him. "BP dropping," a nurse announced. Samuel's chest clenched. "Come on, kid. Stay with me." He adjusted the sutures, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. After 7 hours of surgery, the final stitch was placed. Samuel exhaled sharply, stepping back as the monitor steadied. Jeremiah's heart was beating on its own. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face as relief flooded his veins. "He's stable," he announced. "We did it." The nurses shared quiet, relieved smiles. Samuel removed his gloves, exhaustion sinking into his bones. But there was no greater feeling in the world than saving a life. A mother's tears. Hours later, as dawn began to break, Samuel stepped into the waiting area, where Danielle was still seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She jumped to her feet as soon as she saw him, her eyes searching his face desperately. Samuel smiled. "He's going to be okay." The breath that left Danielle's lips was half a sob, half a prayer. She covered her face, tears spilling freely. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Go see him. He's waiting for you." Danielle ran. Samuel watched her disappear down the hall before turning away, his heart full, but heavy. Because he knew that kindness had a cost, and he had just defied the hospital's administration. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The early morning light filtered through the glass-paneled windows of St. Augustine Medical Center, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Dr. Samuel Carter stood in the hallway, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, watching through the small window of the ICU room as Jeremiah lay sleeping, his chest slowly rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a sweet symphony of survival, proof that the boy had made it through the night. On the chair beside the bed, Danielle, Jeremiah's mother, was asleep, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, as if still bracing against the storm of worry. Samuel couldn't blame her. She had spent the entire night by her son's side, unwilling to leave even for a moment. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Dr. Carter," Linda, the head nurse, whispered, stepping forward. "They're waiting for you in the boardroom." Samuel inhaled deeply, already knowing what was coming. "How bad is it?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. Linda hesitated. "They're not happy." Of course, they weren't. He had performed an expensive, life-saving surgery on a boy with no insurance, no financial backing, and no guarantee of payment. The hospital's administrators didn't care that he had just saved a life. They cared about numbers, policies, and money. With one last glance at Jeremiah, Samuel squared his shoulders and strode toward the administrative wing. The consequences of compassion. Inside the boardroom, 7 individuals sat around the long mahogany table, their suits crisp and expressions cold. At the head of the table was Dr. Arthur Hastings, the hospital's director, a man who had long forgotten the meaning of compassion. His fingers tapped against the table, the rhythmic sound eerily similar to a ticking clock. "Dr. Carter," Hastings began, not bothering with pleasantries. "Do you understand why we've called you in?" Samuel took his seat, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "Because I saved a boy's life." Hastings' mouth tightened. "Because you violated hospital protocol. You admitted an uninsured patient, scheduled a high-risk surgery without prior approval, and performed the procedure under hospital resources without financial clearance. Do you have any idea what kind of liability that creates for us?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "So, if the boy had died in the parking lot, that would have been a better outcome for you." "Don't be dramatic," snapped Margaret Reynolds, one of the financial officers. "We're running a hospital, not a charity. There are protocols for a reason." Samuel sat back, his gaze unwavering. "You're right. This is a hospital, a place where we're supposed to heal people, not turn them away because they can't afford it." A tense silence settled over the room. "You have a reputation, Dr. Carter," Hastings continued, "one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. But that doesn't make you exempt from the rules. This is not the first time you've bent policies in favor of a patient. You're reckless, and that recklessness costs money." Samuel exhaled sharply. "What do you want me to do, Hastings? Let a dying child just waste away because his mother works 3 jobs and still can't afford insurance?" "We want you to understand the consequences of your actions," Hastings replied coolly. "From now on, all non-emergency cases must go through financial review first. If you violate this again, your surgical privileges will be suspended indefinitely." Samuel's stomach tightened, but he knew there was no use fighting this battle today. They cared more about profits than people. "Understood," he muttered. "You're dismissed," Hastings said. Samuel pushed back his chair and stood. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked out, but he didn't look back. He had more important things to do, like making sure Jeremiah woke up with a second chance at life. Jeremiah's awakening. By the time Samuel returned to the ICU, Jeremiah was awake. His brown eyes, once dull with sickness, were now filled with light, scanning the unfamiliar room in curiosity. His small fingers clutched the thin hospital blanket, his frail frame still weak from surgery. "Hey, buddy," Samuel said softly, stepping closer to the bedside. Jeremiah blinked up at him, his lips parting slightly. "Are you the doctor who fixed my heart?" Samuel smiled. "Yeah, that would be me." Jeremiah stared at him for a moment. Then his tiny hand reached out, gripping Samuel's fingers. "Thank you," he whispered, voice hoarse but filled with sincerity. Samuel's chest tightened. He had performed hundreds of surgeries, saved countless lives. But this moment, this small, quiet moment of gratitude, was what made everything worth it. "You're going to be just fine, Jeremiah," Samuel assured him. "You're strong, just like your mom." Jeremiah smiled weakly before his eyes fluttered closed, drifting back to sleep. Samuel turned to Danielle, who was watching the exchange with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," she whispered. Samuel shook his head. "You don't have to." But Danielle wasn't convinced, and neither was Jeremiah. A promise that would change everything. For the next week, Jeremiah remained in recovery, gaining strength little by little. Every time Samuel checked on him, Jeremiah asked more and more questions about being a doctor. "Do you get scared when you do surgery? How do you know where everything is inside someone's body? Did you always want to be a doctor?" Samuel answered every question patiently, amused by the boy's growing curiosity. One evening, as Samuel was reviewing Jeremiah's latest test results, the boy looked at him seriously. "When I grow up," Jeremiah said, "I'm going to be a doctor, just like you." Samuel chuckled. "Oh yeah, Yeah, Jeremiah nodded firmly. So I can help kids who need surgeries, like me. And so no one ever gets turned away. Samuel stilled, his heart clenching at the sincerity in the boy's voice. That's a big dream, he said. Jeremiah grinned. You think I can do it? Samuel knelt beside the bed, looking Jeremiah straight in the eye. I don't just think so, buddy. I know so. Danielle wiped her tears beside them. And at that moment, a promise was made. A promise that would shape the rest of Jeremiah's life. Years later, a dream in the making. The summer heat bore down on the cracked pavement of Westmont High School as Jeremiah Porter adjusted the strap of his old backpack, now a little frayed at the edges from years of use. The once sickly boy who had clung to life in a hospital bed years ago had now grown into a strong, determined young man. At 17, he stood tall, his body lean from years of pushing through physical therapy and rigorous schoolwork. His scar, the one marking the place where Dr. Carter had saved his life, was a permanent reminder of his mission. He had made a promise to himself that day in the hospital. He was going to be a doctor. As he walked toward the school's main entrance, students buzzed with excitement around him. College applications were on everyone's minds. Some of his classmates had wealthy parents who could afford tuition without a second thought. Others talked about taking over their family businesses. For Jeremiah, the stakes were higher. He didn't have money, connections, or a safety net. All he had was his mother, his determination, and the memory of the man who had given him a second chance at life. His mother, Danielle, had worked herself to the bone over the years. She had taken extra cleaning jobs, worked nights, and sacrificed everything so he could study. But even that wouldn't be enough to afford medical school. He needed a scholarship, and today he was about to find out if he got one. The letter that changed everything. The school bell rang, signaling the end of another long day. Jeremiah walked home quickly, his heart pounding against his ribs. His mother had texted him earlier. Jeremiah, a letter came for you. It looks important. He ran the last 2 blocks. Bursting through the front door of their tiny apartment, he found his mother standing in the kitchen, the thin white envelope trembling in her hands. His stomach flipped. This was it. Mom, he breathed. Danielle gave him a tearful smile and handed him the envelope. It's from the university. Jeremiah's fingers shook as he tore it open, his eyes darting across the printed words. The moment his gaze hit the center of the page, his breath hitched. We are pleased to inform you that you have been awarded the Favuol Presidential Academic Scholarship to Winston Medical University. For a long second, Jeremiah just stared at the words. Then his knees buckled. Mom, he gasped, his vision blurring. I got it. A full ride. Danielle let out a sob, covering her mouth as tears spilled over her cheeks. Oh my God. Oh my God. Jeremiah. Before he could react, she pulled him into the tightest hug of his life. They sank to the floor together, sobbing, laughing, clutching the letter as if it were the most precious thing in the world. You did it, baby, she whispered, running her fingers through his hair like she used to when he was small. You made it. But as they sat there, basking in their victory, Jeremiah knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just his achievement. This belonged to Dr. Carter, too. And he was going to find him. Searching for a hero. A week later, Jeremiah sat in a coffee shop with his laptop open, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Dr. Samuel Carter, Street Augustine Medical Center. Click. Jeremiah's brows furrowed as he scrolled through the results. No recent articles, no new research, no recent hospital affiliations. Strange. Digging deeper, he found a small mention in a medical forum. Dr. Carter, once one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, resigned from Street Augustine Medical Center years ago. Rumors say hospital politics forced him out. Retired early. No recent medical work found. Jeremiah's heart dropped. Retired. Forced out. It didn't make sense. Dr. Carter had dedicated his entire life to medicine. Why would he just disappear? Jeremiah wasn't willing to accept that. With a newfound determination, he continued searching. And then, he found it. A residential listing for an address in Pinewood, a quiet suburban town just outside the city. Dr. Carter hadn't vanished. He had simply been forgotten. A forgotten legend. 2 days later, Jeremiah stood outside an old, worn-down house in Pinewood, his heart hammering. The once pristine white paint was peeling, the front lawn overgrown. The man who had once been the best surgeon in the state now lived in a house that looked abandoned. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then, on instinct, he turned toward a small side window. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Dr. Carter lay on the floor, motionless. Jeremiah's body moved before his brain could process. Grabbing a heavy garden rock, he smashed the window. Glass shattered. He climbed through, barely feeling the sting of a small cut on his arm. "Dr. Carter," he shouted, rushing to the man's side. Samuel's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Jeremiah immediately checked for a pulse. Weak, but still there. Jeremiah didn't hesitate. He began chest compressions, just like he had practiced in his emergency response training. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't you dare leave me now." Seconds felt like hours. Then, a sharp inhale. Dr. Carter's eyes fluttered open, confused, disoriented. "Whoa! What?" he croaked, his voice weak. Jeremiah let out a choked laugh of relief, his own hands shaking. "Dr. Carter," he whispered, "you saved my life when I was 12 years old. Now it's my turn." Samuel's eyes widened. He studied the face of the young man before him. The same eyes, the same determination. "Jeremiah," he rasped. Jeremiah nodded, his own tears blurring his vision. "Yeah, Doc. It's me." And for the first time, in a long, long time, Dr. Samuel Carter felt hope. A man left behind. Dr. Samuel Carter lay on the worn leather couch in his dimly lit living room, his body weak, his mind foggy. The pain in his chest had subsided slightly, but the tightness remained. His breathing was slow, steady, yet each inhale felt like a battle. Had it been hours? Days? He wasn't sure anymore. Through the haze, he saw him. A young man with strong features, dark brown eyes, and a familiar fire burning in his gaze. The same eyes he had looked into over a decade ago, when a dying boy had lain in a hospital bed, clinging to life. "Jeremiah," Samuel rasped, his voice hoarse. The boy, no, the man, nodded, his chest still heaving from exertion. "Yeah, Doc, it's me." Samuel tried to push himself up, but his limbs refused to cooperate. What was wrong with him? Why did his body feel so weak? "You need a hospital," Jeremiah said firmly, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "No." Samuel's voice came out sharper than he intended, his fingers weakly grabbing Jeremiah's wrist. "You had a cardiac event, Dr. Carter." Jeremiah insisted, his voice laced with urgency. "You could have died." "But I didn't," Samuel cut him off. His breathing was still shallow, his heart still racing, but something inside him refused to go. "No hospitals." Jeremiah stared at him, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Why?" Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He could already hear the whispers, the pitying looks from former colleagues who once admired him, but now saw him as nothing more than a relic of the past. "They won't treat me like a patient," he muttered, his voice laced with quiet bitterness. "They'll treat me like a washed-up surgeon who outlived his purpose." Jeremiah hesitated. He hadn't expected this. The once great Dr. Carter, the man who had defied hospital bureaucracy to save a child's life, now resigned to his own decline. "I don't believe that," Jeremiah said quietly. Samuel scoffed. "Believe what you want, kid. But the world has a way of leaving people behind. You work long enough in medicine, and one day you wake up realizing you're the one who needs saving, and there's no one left to do it." Jeremiah shook his head. That's not true. I'm here. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, but Jeremiah had already moved, grabbing a chair and sitting down across from him. Then let me do what you did for me, Jeremiah said, his voice thick with emotion. Let me help you, Doc. Samuel stared at him. And for the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone after all. A broken legacy. The next morning, Samuel woke to the scent of coffee brewing and the sound of movement in his kitchen. He blinked in confusion before remembering. Jeremiah was still here. Sitting up with difficulty, Samuel rubbed his face. The house was cleaner than it had been in years. The dishes that had been stacked in the sink were gone. The pile of unopened mail on his dining table was neatly stacked. He looked toward the kitchen. Jeremiah was standing by the stove, frying eggs in an old cast-iron pan like he had lived here his whole life. Samuel frowned. Are you cooking in my house? Jeremiah glanced over his shoulder. Morning to you too. And yeah, you got a problem with that. Samuel let out a dry chuckle. You cook like a medical student. Burnt edges and too much salt. Jeremiah flipped the eggs onto a plate and carried them to the table. Then you should have taught me how to cook instead of how to read an EKG when I was 12. Samuel smirked despite himself. Jeremiah sat across from him, arms crossed. We need to talk, Doc. Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. I figured this was coming. Why did you leave medicine? Jeremiah asked bluntly. Why did you just disappear? Samuel exhaled slowly, staring at the wooden grain of his table. I didn't leave, he muttered. I was pushed out. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. What happened? Samuel hadn't spoken about it in years, but something about Jeremiah, about this kid who refused to let him wallow, made him feel like it was time. I went against the hospital too many times, Samuel admitted. Saved too many patients who couldn't afford it. The board didn't like that. They called it reckless. One day, they gave me an ultimatum. Follow the rules or leave. Jeremiah clenched his fists. So you left. Samuel shook his head. No, I stayed. For a while. But then, his throat tightened. I lost a patient on the table. A young girl. It wasn't a mistake. I did everything right. But it didn't matter. The board used it as their excuse to push me out. Said I wasn't stable enough to be operating anymore. Jeremiah's chest burned with anger. That's bullsh. Samuel raised a hand. Kid, don't waste your energy. It's how the system works. I was good when I made them money. When I stopped playing by their rules, I was a liability. Jeremiah felt sick. The man who had given him a second chance at life, the man who had inspired his entire future, had been discarded like he was nothing. Why didn't you fight back? Jeremiah asked, his voice quiet. Samuel chuckled bitterly. What was I going to do? Sue them? Take them to court? Medicine isn't just about skill, Jeremiah. It's about power. And I didn't have it anymore. Jeremiah wanted to punch something. But that doesn't mean you're useless, Doc, Jeremiah said, his voice raw with emotion. You saved lives. You saved me. You can still help people, even if it's not in an or. Samuel sighed. And what? Spend my days giving advice to some stubborn kid who thinks he can change the world. Jeremiah grinned. Pretty much. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. You really don't give up, do you? Jeremiah's expression softened. I had a good teacher. A long silence stretched between them. And finally, Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. All right, kid, he murmured. Let's see if we can fix what's left of this broken legacy. A new beginning. Over the next few weeks, Jeremiah came by every day. He brought food, cleaned the house, and made sure Samuel took his medications. More importantly, he brought life back into the old doctor's home. One afternoon, Jeremiah walked in holding a folder full of papers. What's this? Samuel asked, eyeing it warily. A job application, Jeremiah said. at a free clinic downtown. They need volunteers, retired physicians, consultants, anyone who can help. Samuel narrowed his eyes. And you think I should apply? Jeremiah smirked. No, Doc. I already applied for you. You start next Monday. Samuel gaped at him. You little. Jeremiah laughed. What's the worst that can happen? They fire you. Samuel stared at him for a moment. Then, for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. Returning to medicine. The Pinewood Free Clinics sat nestled between a laundromat and an old bookstore, its modest red brick exterior standing in stark contrast to the gleaming white hospitals Samuel had once worked in. The clinic wasn't state-of-the-art. It wasn't prestigious, but it was full of people who needed help, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Dr. Samuel Carter stood at the entrance, staring at the rusted metal sign that read Pinewood Community Health and Wellness Center. He hadn't stepped foot in a medical facility since the day he had been forced out of St. Augustine Medical Center. That day, he had walked out with nothing but his pride, and a sense of betrayal so deep it had nearly crushed him. And now, here he was, standing before a clinic that served the kind of people the hospitals had turned away. Ready, Doc. Samuel turned his head to see Jeremiah, standing beside him with an easy grin. The kid looked too happy about this. Samuel exhaled, adjusting the sleeves of his old white coat, the same coat he hadn't worn in years. Not sure, he admitted. But you already signed me up, so what choice do I have? Jeremiah chuckled. Exactly. No backing out now. Samuel grumbled under his breath, but a small part of him, one he had ignored for years, felt something strange. Excitement. For the first time in forever, he was about to save lives again. The first patient. The clinic's interior was nothing like the sterile, pristine hospitals Samuel had worked in before. The floors were scuffed, the walls lined with outdated posters about flu shots and nutrition, and the front desk was staffed by a single overworked receptionist who barely looked up from her computer screen as they entered. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing scrubs that had seen better days, walked toward them, clipboard in hand. You must be Dr. Carter, she said, extending a hand. I'm Miriam, head nurse here. We're happy to have you. Samuel shook her hand. Appreciate it. What's the workload like? Miriam let out a short laugh. Take a guess. We see anywhere from 50 to 70 patients a day, most of them uninsured or unable to afford care elsewhere. You're in for a long shift, Doc. Samuel's lips twitched. Sounds like my kind of place. Miriam handed him the clipboard. Good, because we've got a patient waiting for you already. Room 3. Without hesitation, Samuel walked down the narrow hall, pushing open the door to his first patient in years. Inside, a young boy sat on the exam table, clutching his arm, his small face twisted in pain. Beside him, a woman, his mother, stood wringing her hands, worry written across her tired face. Samuel's doctor's instincts kicked in immediately. Hey, buddy, he said gently, stepping forward. What happened? The boy sniffled. I fell off my bike. Samuel carefully examined the arm. Fracture. Not a bad one, but definitely painful. We'll get you fixed up, Samuel said, glancing at the mother. Don't worry, ma'am. We'll take good care of him. The woman's shoulders sagged in relief. Thank you, doctor. I didn't know where else to take him. The hospital. They said we needed insurance before they could even see him. Samuel stilled for a second, rage flickering deep in his gut. Some things never change. He took a deep breath and focused on the boy. You're in the right place, he said. Let's get that arm set, all right. The boy nodded, and for the first time since stepping into the clinic, Samuel felt it. Purpose. He wasn't just a man left behind by the system. He was still a doctor. And he still had work to do. Jeremiah's first test. Meanwhile, Jeremiah sat in his small college dorm room, staring at his open organic chemistry textbook, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Medical school was brutal. The first few months had been a storm of late-night studying, back-to-back exams, and the constant pressure to be the best. And he was doing well. Better than well, actually. He had ranked among the top students in his first semester, acing every exam. But something still felt off. His classmates were obsessed with grades, rankings, and research papers. They spent hours debating the best ways to climb the academic ladder. But for Jeremiah, medicine wasn't about prestige. It was about people. And that wasn't something they taught in textbooks. His phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Carter. "Kid, if you think med school is hard, wait until you're responsible for real lives. Let me know when you're ready for a real test." Jeremiah grinned. He didn't just want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a doctor like Dr. Carter. The fight isn't over. For weeks, Samuel worked at the clinic, rebuilding his confidence and rediscovering his passion. And yet, something still haunted him. The past. One evening after a long shift, Samuel walked into his small house to find an envelope sitting on his kitchen table. He frowned. He hadn't seen an envelope like this in years. Embossed, official-looking, the kind that usually carried bad news. With slightly trembling hands, he tore it open. Inside was a formal letter. "St. Augustine Medical Center is under new administration. We request the presence of Dr. Samuel Carter for an important meeting regarding past events." Samuel's breath caught. Why now? For years, the hospital had pretended he didn't exist. Now they wanted him back. He clenched his jaw. He wasn't finished fighting. And if St. Augustine thought they could bury the past, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. A call from the past. Dr. Samuel Carter sat at his worn kitchen table. The letter from St. Augustine Medical Center spread out before him like a specter from a past he had long tried to forget. His hands curled into fists as he read it again. For years, they had ignored him. For years, they had let his name fade from the halls he once walked, from the surgical rooms where he had saved hundreds of lives. Now, suddenly, they wanted him back. The letter was polite, almost formal, as if the hospital's administration had suddenly decided that he was worth speaking to again. But Samuel wasn't naive. He knew institutions didn't send invitations out of kindness. Something was wrong. "Are you going to sit there and glare at that letter all day, or are you actually going to tell me what's in it?" Samuel looked up to see Jeremiah standing in the doorway, arms crossed. The kid had the same determined expression he always wore whenever he sensed something important was happening. Samuel exhaled sharply, pushing the letter across the table. Jeremiah picked it up, skimming the words. When he reached the end, his eyes darkened. "They want you back at St. Augustine." Jeremiah frowned. "Why now?" "That's what I'd like to know," Samuel muttered. "I haven't heard from them in 7 years. They fired me, pushed me out, and now suddenly I'm important again." Jeremiah hesitated before speaking. "Are you gonna go?" Samuel scoffed. "Why would I?" "Because you need closure," Jeremiah said simply, setting the letter down. "And because you're still Dr. Samuel Carter, the man who doesn't walk away when people need him." Samuel let out a dry laugh. "You've got too much faith in me, kid." Jeremiah grinned. "You had faith in me first." Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. The kid had a point. Maybe it was time to face his past, once and for all. After a long pause, he stood. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what St. Augustine wants." Walking through familiar doors, the moment Samuel stepped into the hospital, the memories came rushing back. The smell of antiseptic and fresh linens, the steady beeping of heart monitors, the hurried clicking of nurses' shoes on the polished floors. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. Doctors and nurses moved past him without recognition. The young interns who had once followed him like shadows were gone, replaced by a new generation of medical staff who didn't know his name. To them, he was just another man in an old white coat. Except for one person. Dr. Carter. Samuel turned, his breath catching slightly as he saw her. Dr. Evelyn Monroe. One of the last true doctors he had respected at this place. She had been a young attending back then, but now she carried herself with the authority of someone who had fought her way up the ranks. "Evelyn," Samuel said, nodding. Her sharp brown eyes softened for just a second before she spoke. "You actually came." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That surprises you." "Honestly." Evelyn smirked. "Yeah. After what they did to you, I wasn't sure you'd ever step foot in this place again." Samuel crossed his arms. "So tell me, why am I here?" Evelyn glanced around before gesturing for him to follow. "Let's talk somewhere private." They walked down the hall, past bustling nurses and patients, until they reached her office. As soon as the door shut behind them, Evelyn turned to him. "Samuel, the hospital is in trouble," she said bluntly. Samuel leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Trouble how?" Evelyn exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "The new board of directors is trying to undo the damage caused by the last administration, the one that forced you out. But there's more. St. Augustine is under scrutiny for rejecting too many uninsured patients. There's been a lawsuit, media coverage. They need a face to fix this mess." Samuel laughed, shaking his head. "And they think that's me." Evelyn hesitated. "Yes, but there's another reason too." She pulled out a medical file and handed it to him. Samuel frowned as he flipped it open. His eyes scanned the reports, his pulse slowing as he realized what he was looking at. A critically ill child, suffering from a rare congenital heart defect. "His name is Andrew," Evelyn said quietly. 7 years old. He's been rejected by 3 hospitals already. His parents have no insurance, no resources. If we don't help him, he won't make it." Samuel's fingers tightened around the file. This wasn't just about St. Augustine trying to fix their image. This was about a child who was about to be another casualty of a broken system. And Samuel wasn't going to let that happen. "All right," he muttered. "Where is he?" Evelyn gave a small smile. "Come on. I'll take you to him." Jeremiah's biggest challenge yet. Meanwhile, back at Winston Medical University, Jeremiah was facing a challenge of his own. It wasn't another exam. It wasn't late-night studying. It was a patient. His first real patient. As part of his medical training, he had been assigned to a free clinic for rotations, shadowing experienced doctors as they treated patients who couldn't afford hospital care. And today, he was asked to take the lead on a case for the first time. The patient, a pregnant woman in her late 20s, clutching her stomach in pain. Jeremiah's heart pounded. He wasn't a doctor yet. He didn't have the years of experience Dr. Carter had. But he had learned one thing from his mentor. Fear doesn't save lives. Action does. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Hi, ma'am," he said gently, grabbing a pair of gloves. "I'm Jeremiah Porter. Tell me what's going on." The woman winced. Something's wrong. I don't have insurance, but..." "Don't worry about that," Jeremiah said quickly. "We're gonna take care of you, all right." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Jeremiah glanced at the supervising doctor, who nodded in approval. This was it, his first real test, and he was ready. Samuel's redemption. Dr. Samuel Carter stood at the entrance of the pediatric ICU, gripping the patient file in his hands. It had been 7 years since he last set foot in St. Augustine Medical Center, and yet, standing here again, about to face a challenge that had nothing to do with politics or board meetings, only saving a life, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Beside him, Dr. Evelyn Monroe watched his face carefully. "You okay?" Samuel inhaled deeply. Only one way to find out. Together, they stepped inside. Lying on the hospital bed, attached to an array of monitors and IV drips, was Andrew, the 7-year-old boy who had been rejected by multiple hospitals. His thin frame was swallowed by the hospital blanket, his skin pale, lips almost bluish. Signs of oxygen deprivation. Samuel's chest tightened. He had seen this before, too many times. The boy's parents stood by the bedside, a young mother and father, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. "Dr. Carter," Evelyn said softly, stepping forward. "This is Andrew's mother and father. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, this is Dr. Carter. He's one of the best." Samuel almost flinched at the words. He had once been the best, but was he still? The mother's eyes widened. "Doctor, please, can you save him?" Samuel looked from her to the tiny, fragile boy fighting for every breath, and in that moment, every doubt in his mind disappeared. "I'll do everything I can," he said firmly. He turned to the medical charts, flipping through them quickly. The hole in Andrew's heart was worsening, and there were complications. His lungs were already under strain. This wasn't just a delicate case. This was life or death. And there was only one way forward. "He needs surgery," Samuel said, closing the file. "Immediately." The mother let out a small sob, covering her mouth. The father's eyes glistened, but he nodded. "Do whatever you have to do, doctor." Samuel turned to Evelyn. "I need an OR, a full surgical team, and the best anesthesiologist you've got." Evelyn gave him a small, knowing smirk. "So, you're officially back, huh?" Samuel rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of the past fall away. "Yeah," he said, "I am." Jeremiah's first life or death decision. At Winston Medical University, Jeremiah could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The pregnant woman in front of him was in distress. Her face was pale, beads of sweat covered her forehead, and her hands clutched her stomach. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you're feeling?" Jeremiah asked as calmly as he could. "Pain," she whispered, breathing heavily. Something's wrong." The supervising doctor beside him watched closely, waiting for Jeremiah to take the lead. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't an exam. This was real, and it was up to him to figure out what was happening. His mind raced through the possibilities. Preterm labor, placental abruption, internal bleeding. "All right," Jeremiah said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Let's do a quick ultrasound." A nurse handed him the portable ultrasound machine. His hand shook slightly as he applied the gel to her abdomen, pressing the probe gently against her skin. The screen lit up, showing the image of the baby. Heartbeat was there, but it was irregular. Something was wrong. Then he saw it, internal bleeding. "She needs an emergency C-section," Jeremiah said, his voice steady. He turned to the supervising doctor. "If we wait, we could lose both the baby and the mother." The doctor studied him for a long second. Then, with a small nod, he said, "All right, let's move her to the OR. You're assisting." Jeremiah exhaled sharply, then nodded. This was it. His first real step toward becoming a doctor. Samuel enters the OR again. Back at Street Augustine, Samuel scrubbed in. For the first time in 7 years, he was back in his element. The surgical team stood around him, waiting for instructions. Some of them were young, unfamiliar faces who had only heard stories of the man who had once been a legend in these halls. Others were former colleagues, doctors and nurses who had worked beside him years ago, now staring at him with mixed emotions. But once Samuel entered the OR, there was no past, no politics, no hesitation. There was only the patient. The monitors beeped steadily as Andrew lay on the table, his small body still beneath the sterile drapes. Samuel took a deep breath. "Scalpel," he said. And just like that, the world disappeared. 2 lives, 2 miracles. Hours later, 2 surgeries, miles apart, ended with the same result. Victory. At Winston Medical, Jeremiah stood in stunned silence as the baby's first cry filled the operating room. He had done it. They had saved them both. His eyes burned with emotion, but when the supervising doctor clapped him on the back, Jeremiah could only grin. "Welcome to the real world of medicine, kid," the doctor said. "You did good today." Jeremiah nodded. Thank you. Dr. Carter would be proud. Meanwhile, at Street Augustine, Samuel removed his gloves, stepping back from the operating table as Andrew's heart monitor beat steadily. Evelyn let out a slow breath beside him. You did it, she murmured. Samuel gave her a small smile. No, he did. The weight of 7 years lifted off his chest. He had walked into this hospital thinking he had nothing left to give. But today, he had proven he was still Dr. Samuel Carter. And he always would be. A promise fulfilled. A week later, Jeremiah walked into Samuel's small house, holding 2 things in his hands. One was a framed medical school acceptance letter, his official invitation to enter his first year as a student doctor. The other, a brand new stethoscope, carefully wrapped in a box. Samuel raised an eyebrow. What's this? Jeremiah set both items on the table, his face serious but full of gratitude. You saved my life when I was 12, he said. You didn't have to, but you did. You gave me the chance to become who I am today. Samuel opened the box, pulling out the stethoscope. Now it's my turn to return the favor, Jeremiah said, because I wouldn't be here without you. Samuel swallowed thickly, staring down at the gift. He wasn't a man who cried. But if he was, this would be the moment. He looked at the young man in front of him, the boy he had once saved, now standing before him as his greatest legacy. You're gonna be a damn good doctor, kid, Samuel murmured. Jeremiah smiled. I had the best teacher. The past was behind them. But the future was just beginning.